Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers and I'm joined by Spike's editor, Tom Slater, on this extraordinary day in British politics to discuss the unravelling of Liz Truss. So it's over. Liz Truss is out. 44 days in office, making her the shortest serving Prime Minister in history. It's been an incredible just whirlwind of sort of just 6 weeks. Tom, what's your sort of immediate reaction to this resignation?
Well, of course, it was inevitable by this point. Of course, she had to go. The lettuce had to win. The Thatcher Tribute Act had to hang up her pussy bow for good because of everything that has happened. Even since we last recorded the podcast on Saturday, her position has become more and more untenable. And I suppose the feeling I'm left with at this particular point is just, in a way, how surprising it was that she was ever elevated that particular office in the first place.
Yeah.
She's come under incredible pressure from a lot of quite sort of extreme and anti-democratic forces in some respects, the force of the markets, the technocrats, the media, all of those things we'll probably talk about. But there was also just a thing that was always at the centre, which is that she is just really sort of rubbish. I mean, the argument that was made for her going into all of this was that she was underestimated. When we got up at Tory Party conference, and he's famous for jabbering about cheese and pork markets and all the rest of it, is just this on the quiet genius who really has a plan, really has a vision for the country and is there to implement it. Given what's happened since that mini budget was delivered, it was all junked. And then just everything in the Tory party just kind of completely fell apart and a government just crumbled before our very eyes. You are just left with that sense that it's been in British politics for some time, though. It's just the substance, the quality of these individuals is so low. And I think that's one thing that seeing her give that very brief and very clipped resignation speech where she could barely scrape together two achievements in which to talk about just really ram that home, I think.
It is a pretty damning indictment of Westminster that we've ended up with a British, Prime Minister who is only about 4 percentage points higher in her approval rating than Vladimir Putin, who, as you alluded to, didn't manage to outlast the shelf life of a lettuce. This
the
Daily Star live stream. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're right, Tom. I mean, why do you think she was so unpopular? Why did she totally fail to connect with the public? I mean, there's an argument to say that she didn't even try.
No, I think that's right. I mean, she made a virtue out of the fact that her programme was unpopular and that she was there to kind of administer the medicine that was needed, even if the public weren't that up for it. There was even a quote doing the rounds where, when there was a lot of speculation about, is she going to say, how could she possibly cling on, saying that, Liz, she's like, we're not populists, we're here to do what is right and all the rest of it. So, of course, she never really had the public on side. She was kind of part of a very small layer of politics and of society that, to the extent that it's interested in Brexit, it is to basically kind of ramp out a sort of, if you wanted to put it somewhat unkindly, kind of Singapore-on-Thames type of programme, which the working classes who voted for the Tory party and for Brexit just were never going to wear, and that was pretty obvious. I think what that was compounded by was the fact that she also didn't have the support really of her own party. She certainly didn't have the support of the broader establishment. And also she was fundamentally inept, as it finally turned out. I mean, not that we want to fetishize competence and being good managers and all the rest of it, but I think that was the one thing that was really rammed home. The market reaction took her by surprise. Probably even the polling reaction took her by surprise. There was no attempt to roll the pitch for this particular programme. And then what we've seen in recent days is even the kind of fundamental basics of sort of party management, of being able to deal with your communications, which became a scandal about 24 hours ago, of course, in relation to that. Her
speeches are just so wooden,
On every sort of level. So anywhere that she could look to gain authority from, her parliamentary party, the public, even just having the support of, the markets or whatever, all of them evaporated or just weren't there to begin with. And so I suppose the writing was on the wall from that point onwards.
I think, that's fair enough. And, she wasn't really much of a Democrat. She never, as you said, she never tried to win the support of the public. But it seems as if some of the forces that have ousted her are even less democratic. I mean, it sort of begins with the reaction of the markets to the mini budget. Then, we have this sort of technocratic takeover in the form of Jeremy Hunt and Grant Shapps, who seem to be thanking Jeremy Hunt, the de facto leader, for his new position rather than Truss. I mean, that is also a kind of alarming aspect to this as well, isn't it?
Definitely. I think the first point is worth saying is the fact that her inadequacies created a vacuum.
Yeah.
And her inability to even just stick to a particular programme. You could argue as to whether it was even possible for her to do so, given how haywire things went. But at the same time, we just got into a situation in which the orthodoxy, in which the technocrats just filled the gap. They reasserted themselves quite naturally. And Jeremy Hunt taking over just under a week ago, as it was now, becoming the Chancellor and almost immediately saying that Trussonomics was over, that it was shredded, that we were going to see both tax rises and spending cuts, that so many of her kind of flagship policies, that even the energy security guarantee, which was the last thing she really had to shout about, was going to be trimmed back from 2 years to 6 months. And what's interesting about that, I mean, the first thing to say is that was fundamentally, it was a coup. I mean, it was a soft coup. It was a bloodless coup. But
well, it even had the coup visuals with that strange television address of,
the flags in the background.
So you called him General Hunt. He didn't, speaking to us down the camera.
All that was missing were the medals and the epaulets and things.
Yeah.
But it was really quite striking. But on the other hand, what was interesting about it, I mean, the reason Jeremy Hunt was there, James Forsyth's Spectator column this week kind of makes this point. It wasn't because he was seen as the one in the party who had a brilliant understanding of the markets, who really knew what would calm them. It's because he would do what he was told. Yeah. It was because that he would listen to the Bank of England, to the Treasury, to the orthodoxy, effectively. And that's why he was elevated, effectively. So what we're seeing, it's not as if Jeremy Hunt and Grant Shapps have kind of met in a room above a pub and decided they're going to take over the government or anything like that. They were also invited in, both of them, it's worth saying. But it was also just the fact that in that vacuum that Truss's rubbishness created, it was filled by the forces of technocracy, of orthodoxy, of all the rest of it. And it was fascinating. It was almost like a internal, almost just within the Tory Party, replaying of what we saw in the wake of the debt crisis in Europe in 2011, in Greece and Italy, where essentially you have unelected figures, or in Jeremy Hunt's case, at least elected by his constituents, if no one else, coming in to sort out the mess, to dole out the medicine, to enforce the austerity measures. And what was different about this case is it was happening at the invitation of Liz Truss, and it was happening kind of within the Tory party itself, within the political class itself. But that was still the effect of it, was to say that this particular administration has lost the confidence of the experts in the markets and so on. And so it needs to be elbowed aside or lobotomized, at least in this particular case.
Lobotomized isn't that word, because you could see her, when Jeremy Hunt was delivering his statement to the Commons, Liz Truss just sort of sat there with a blank stare as her whole programme is being torn up. I mean, it seems a real tragedy that this particular moment has emboldened the experts, the technocrats, if you like, because they're now using this as an opportunity to say, look what happens when you have democracy. They're blaming it on Brexit. They're blaming it on the idiocy of the Conservative Party membership, who should never be allowed to have a say again, rather than seeing it, as we've seen it, as a bit of a Liz Truss had didn't have the public on her side.
No, exactly. And I think that's that reassertion of the old ways of doing things, of the old technocracy, this kind of tyranny of the consensus, as it's defined by a handful of people, has been really quite explicit. I mean, there was this William Hague column in the Sunday Times, I believe, or the Times, making precisely this point, that the age of ideology is over. It was a very brief age if it did exist. And that now it's all about competence. There was a particular line, I can't remember it exactly, but it was effectively along the lines of, the question is now, how do we work out how to work within the constraints that we cannot escape? You've seen the word orthodoxy come back as a positive. Because obviously that was something that people would usually use to rail against Treasury orthodoxy, a failed orthodoxy, the idea that the old ways of doing things had failed us and so on. But you're seeing sort of Financial Times journalists and other people saying, hailing the return of the orthodoxy, which I think on the one hand shows how much those sections of politics, their kind of tails are up, as it were. They recognise this as a sort of win for them. But at the same time, I think it also reminds us what a bloodless worldview that is, uninspiring, the kind of most desiccated form of kind of of the old politics.
Nothing should change, nothing should grow, no disruption.
And that's something which is going to engender a backlash as it did before. And I think that the riding high at the moment, the idea that we've put that strange period, that strange post-Brexit period to bed is completely ridiculous, because in what they're talking about here is basically kind of recreating the conditions that gave birth to the sort of populist revolt in the first place. So I think it's naive, to say the least, on their part, for them to feel like they're riding so high at this particular juncture,
Whenever I'm learning something new, I really feel like I'm accomplishing something, whether I'm learning for fun or to help with a project or a job. And that's why I love Wondrium. Wondrium is a brilliant educational platform where there's just so much to learn and explore with its vast library of audio and video series. And with everything on Wondrium presented by top university professors and experts, I know that it's trustworthy too. Recently, I've been fascinated by the great mythologies of the world on Wondrium. From the Greek gods to Romulus and Remus, all the way to Odin and Thor, this engrossing series takes you on a visual tour of the world's most enduring myths. With morals to learn and heroes to emulate, the very foundations of a civilization are encoded in these ancient stories. So give it a watch on Wondrium. It's absolutely legendary. Wondrium makes it easy to learn exactly what you want, whenever you want. And with over 8,000 hours of content, you can dive deep into one subject or explore anything and everything you've ever been curious about. So, if you enjoy the great mythologies of the world, then you can try the series Heroes and Legends, the most influential characters of literature, and many more series like it. And you'll have unlimited access to all of it with Wondrium. I know you'll love Wondrium as much as I do. And right now, Wondrium is offering Spiked podcast viewers and listeners a special limited time offer. Sign up using this special URL to get 50% off your first 3 months of Wondrium. That's half off when you sign up for your first quarterly plan. It's a fantastic deal. So go now to wondrium.com/spiked to take advantage of this great offer. Again, that's wondrium.com/spiked. Wondrium.com/spiked. I mean, it's obviously, we don't know who's going to be the next leader. It's hard to say what direction the Tory Party is going to take over this. But if we assume that, either Truss's vision or even the sort of technocratic vision as being set out by Jeremy Hunt, that is a major betrayal from where the Tories were in 2019. The extraordinary kind of shift from the sort of populism light, I guess, that Boris was offering to what we have now. I mean, what do you think that means for the Conservative Party?
Well, I think it's just shown that it hasn't really no idea what it's doing, because especially in the wake of Brexit itself, there was that amazing moment where it felt like both of the parties were just going to kind of collapse. You know, these two corpses that had been propping each other up would finally kind of fall in on each other. And what a handful of people, and it only ever really was a handful of people, which is why it was so vulnerable, within the Tory party spied an opportunity, which was not to hijack this to turn us into some neoliberal fantasy island, as the kind of left anti-Brexiteers would suggest that they would.
Or that Liz Truss might have liked.
No, that probably sounds quite good from her perspective. That failed project, but that a kind of politics which would cultivate this new kind of Brexity working class base that would try to respond, even if it wasn't a slightly partial and incomplete way, to that demand for more democracy, for their concerns to be put back on the table, for politics to become more responsive to them, for those concerns about globalization or technocracy or whatever word it is that we're or whatever phenomenon it is that we're describing, was going to be kind of front and centre, and they could in many respects kind of carve out a new base for themselves. They were handed that, now they've completely squandered it. And what I think is interesting at this point is that you're left with a party that is not so much divided. We often say that about the Tory party. It's divided. It's not divided. It's dissolving. It's evaporating. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about recent days, and we've seen this over recent years as well, is that there's not even kind of two coherent factions split on a particular issue. Certainly not post 2019, when a lot of the kind of Remainer hardcore anti-Brexiteers more or less got kicked out of the party, and the other ones who were of that ilk just had to put up with it, essentially. It's become even more sort of confused, and the different lines make no sense. People back one leadership challenger last time around. You think, really? Like, there was just this kind of it had just become a kind of party of 300 or so individual factions, you know, rather than something that was quite coherent. So having squandered that opportunity to give themselves some purpose, given the fact that, you know, that position they had as the old party, the establishment, had kind of worn itself out, they squandered it, and they don't know what to revert back to. Yeah. They genuinely have no idea what they're for. I think that was part of the reason why Liz Truss came forward. You know, it was kind of, again, it was this, the Thatcher Tribute Act thing at least gave it a kind of aura of coherence and something that they could understand.
Even if only cosplaying at something.
Exactly. But now, what is it? They don't know. And that's a big part of what makes things so incredibly hard to call at this particular point. Yeah,
it's sort of you do wonder, what is the point of them even limping on in government? You know, the need for a sort of general election feels, you know, much more immediate now than ever.
I mean, we definitely need one. We needed one when Liz Truss took over, not just because it was such a diversion from the 2019 manifesto and what that represented. But, at least she was elected by 82,000 people.
Yeah.
And it was 82,000 more than Jeremy Hunt had, given he didn't even make the leadership ballot last time around. And now we're in a whole different phase where we're going to see another leader come in. The only chance of one of them having a democratic mandate was if Boris staged some sort of unlikely comeback. It's a very, very strange state of affairs.
British Berlusconi.
He becomes a pound shop Berlusconi, but with a much lamer party scandal behind him, dogging him. But it's such a strange time because the whole, we're laughing and it's an absurd spectacle. And the Tory Party, famously one of the most successful political party in history, has produced all of these, whatever you think of them, historical figures, whether you're talking about Peel or Churchill or Thatcher or whoever, has just come down to this. It's absurd, but also it's the tragedy being that not only have those voters who were finally listened to have now been sort of abandoned again, but also there's that sense of, no one being around to meet the crisis and what that requires. There being no one who has a conceivable idea of not only getting a grip on this, but doing so in a way that has voters at its heart, that public support, all the rest of it. There's just so little prospect of that at this point, which is why general election is so important. Regardless of what happens, how much it kind of scrambles the dials, is something that really needs to happen. But at the same time, I think out of sheer self-interest, they'll want to limp on as long as they can, just because they'll assume, I suppose, that it can't get any worse than this, which maybe it can.
Well, yeah, the polls are, not looking good. People are assuming a sort of massive electoral wipeout, hundreds of safe seats being lost. So, yeah, you can see why they'd want to cling on for dear life just for another 2 more years or so. But Labour's not really offering an alternative, not really stepping up to the plate to meet the challenges of today, I think it's fair to say.
No, I mean, they're just the beneficiaries of the collapse of the Tory Party. I think that's obvious to anyone. Keir Starmer has been playing this incredibly cautious game, and it's paid off, I guess, but in quite spectacular and extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah.
So it's not really a vindication of him. I don't think people are desperate for him. I think it's this is effectively the fault of the Tory Party and its complete collapse, its complete idiocy, its inability to actually grab onto the opportunity that it was handed to it. You get that kind of sense now that they're actually almost semi-relieved that it's all over, that they don't have to pretend to like those red wall voters.
I think they're quite happy to betray them.
Because, most of them had no idea what all that was about, really. And Keir Starmer is the beneficiary of that. I mean, we're in the bizarre situation in which the Labour Party has a lead amongst Brexit voters, led by the man who backed a second referendum, who marched next to Emily Thornberry, who was wearing a kind of EU flag dress, all of this.
The man who said your vote doesn't count.
Essentially. Yeah, exactly. And this is where we are, but that's not because everyone is really won over to his programme. I think the other thing that's worth saying is that, whatever a Keir Starmer leadership, premiership, I should say, looks like, it's not going to meet the challenges of today. It's not going to meet that desire for more representation and democracy, not least because in the last few days, almost explicitly, he has capitulated to the very consensus, the very kind of narrow, there is no alternative, which has reasserted itself.
Yeah.
The most he could possibly hope to do is, sort of nibble around the edges of that particular consensus. You might get a sure start centre, but you're not going to get much else in terms of transformative politics.
It could be Sir Keir delivering the austerity measures, quite conceivably.
Exactly. And what I really worry about is the fact that it's going to sort of breed a level of, particularly if because of the Tory implosion, you get kind of quite a substantial Labour majority, is that's going to mask a lot of alienation.
Yeah.
The pundits will think common sense has broken out again. The elites are back in control. Keir Starmer's a clubbable individual. Look at that mandate. Everyone's happy with it. But, it was a bit like, the Blair governments in the early 2000s and so on. The successes masked a lot of political disaffection, working class voters peeling off. I think a lot of people will go back to not voting. I don't think they're going to just rush back over into the Labour column necessarily. But as I say, I think it just underlines how much the Tory party has fucked it, rather than Keir Starmer playing any blinder in any meaningful sense.
I mean, is there a future for populism? As you said, those voters are still there. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to be satisfied with whatever is going to be put on offer, either from the Tories or from Labour in the next few weeks.
Well, I think it will re-emerge because it always does. And I think, as we were talking about earlier, the conditions which brought it about and have sustained it haven't really gone away. If anything, I think what we'll probably see is a kind of elite overstep, believing that we're back in control. We can ram our own, whether it's economic orthodoxies or slightly bizarre cultural values down everybody's throats. We've got a taste of that. There's the climate stuff as well, definitely. But, you know, even with the sort of the woke politics stuff, we've got a taste of that with Keir Starmer at the Pink News Awards, talking about what he wants to do with Gender Recognition Act, and even making some noises towards toughening up hate crime, which basically means hate speech, which basically means censorship these days. And I think that's something we saw in America with Biden. You know, they get back in power, and there's this kind of almost doubling down on a failed agenda. And I think what we've seen in places, both in America and also places across Europe, is that this will find an outlet. Even if it's not a particular political party right now, because there's not many options on the table. One thing that I've found is that, you know, it always explodes somewhere else at some point, whether it's a protest movement, whether it's a particular issue in which people were taking on the establishment. You see it take so many different forms, whether it's the Gilets Jaunes or the parents' movement in America, or wherever it is. You can't suppress this, because fundamentally what this is about, whether we're talking about politics and representation, whether we're talking about the economy, whether we're talking about values and the culture war and so on, is that across the board, there's this desire to push a failed consensus, an elite consensus, an unpopular consensus down people's throats. And I think, remembering that Brexit was only 6 or 7 years ago, people aren't going to put up with that forever. So I think what we're seeing with the Tory party is that the one vehicle in the mainstream amongst the two main parties that could have been used to kind of push that a little bit further has been found wanting because of the short-sightedness, idiocy, and just naffness of the Tory party. But it's not gone away. How could it? And I think the question is now, what form does it take? There's always that danger that you do breed a level of disaffection. People felt like they could reshape politics. They felt like they were being listened to. They felt they could make an impact. And then they were not only ignored by, say, their old party in the form of the Labour Party, they were then failed by the party that they switched to. But at the same time, you know, you never know where it's going to explode. And I think to act as if, oh, it's just gone now, it's dead, is absurd because those voters haven't gone away and their concerns haven't been wiped off the map just because Liz Truss has imploded, as we always knew she would, if not this soon.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.